Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Akasemi Newsome, and I'm the Associate Director of the Institute of European Studies at UC Berkeley. And I would like to welcome you all to today's conversation on race and policing in the EU. This conversation will be recorded, and I will be moderating the discussion between our panel of experts. My colleague, Heike Friedman, is also moderating this event behind the scenes. The way things will work is that I will pose questions to our panel for about 30 minutes, and then I'll pass on your questions from the audience, which you will input via the chat function on Zoom. This will take place during the second half hour of the event. So please do write down your questions in the chat function at the bottom of your screen. Now let's dive right in while I introduce our guest speakers to you. Going in alphabetical order. Eddie Bruce Jones is Deputy Dean at Birkbeck College of Law in London. Dr. Bruce Jones serves on the boards of directors of the Institute for Race Relations and the UK Lesbian and Gay Immigration Group, and the advisory board of the Center for Intersectional Justice in Berlin. He's a comparative law specialist for the Independent Commission on the Death of Uri Jalloh on Police Brutality and Due Process in Germany, as well as Sexuality and Gender Identity Resource Coordinator for the Refugees in Exile program of the International Refugee Rights Initiative. His most recent book is Race in the Shadow of Law, State Violence in Contemporary Europe, which came out in 2016. Terri Givens is the CEO and founder of the Center for Higher Education Leadership. She has more than 30 years of success in higher education, politics, international affairs, and nonprofits. Terri has held leadership positions as Vice Provost at the University of Texas at Austin and Provost of Menlo College, where she was the first African-American and first woman to do so. She's also held professorships at the University of Texas at Austin and the University of Washington. She was the founding director of the Center for European Studies at the University of Texas and led the university's efforts in Mexico and Latin America as vice provost for international activities. Terri is the author and editor of several books and articles on immigration policy, European politics, and security. Her most recent book is Legislating Equality, the Politics of Anti-Discrimination Policy in Europe, pertaining to our discussion, which came out 2014. Tamas Kadar is the Deputy Director, Head of Legal and Policy of EQUINET, which stands for the European Network of Equality Bodies, which are public institutions fighting discrimination at the national level. Through EQUINET, members are able to share their expertise at the European level. The network ensures that information and knowledge flows move as efficiently as possible between members in order to learn from the successes achieved, addressing discrimination, and the challenges raised during the implementation of their mandate at the national level. So as an opening question, I think it's important to state that many UC Berkeley students, scholars, and members of the Bay Area community with interests in Europe have heard on the news about US-based police violence against people of color, particularly African Americans, as well as demonstrations in Europe supporting the victims of the violence. What our audience knows little about is the issue of policing and race in Europe. So in your introductory statement, how would you characterize the issue of policing and race in Europe? And how does the work that you do in your specific organization intersect with this issue? And I'll give the floor first to Eddie Bruce Jones.
Thanks so much, Akasemi, and thank you, Heike and Akasemi and the Institute for European Studies for inviting me. It's really great to have this conversation because I think the assumption, as you mentioned, Akasemi, is that this is an issue that's acute to the American context and that it's, race is something that happens in the United States as kind of a conceptual idea about where race is relevant and where it isn't. And in Europe, a lot of times whether I'm in, whether I'm at the university or doing work with an NGO, race a lot of times gets pushed to the margins of the conceptual analysis and regarded as something that isn't as useful in a European context. That's not always the case, and I think it is changing. But it's not unusual to have a response that's quite bluntly saying race and the concept of race can be approximated using ethnicity or using any number of different ways of asking about difference. So language, country of origin, nationality, where your parents were born, all of these different things. And it's in order not to use this admittedly very complex notion of race, but it's also to claim what my colleague Cengiz Başkamaz calls a type of exceptionalism, not just saying America has an exceptional position with regard to race, but that Europe has its own exceptionalism, which means that it's immune to this idea that race should be a useful concept. So in terms of characterizing policing and race in Europe, I think a commonality that you'll find in probably most places in the world is that police have a great deal of discretionary power to be able to secure, public safety and security and that sort of thing. And that power is a broad one that domestic law doesn't necessarily, paint into a corner. It allows police to be able to justify certain actions quite broadly. And then at the European level, European Union legislation and the human rights jurisprudence at the European Court of Human Rights also kind of provide very broad parameters so that when you see the intersection of how policing work is done and how race is used in that work, there's not very tight regulatory process around it. And I'm not saying there should be a very, very tight European-wide regulatory process, but it just means that the problem is even more acute when it's difficult to talk about how race comes into the conversation. So discrimination law, for example, provides a very, very general backstop where if you can't use race as the reason for targeting communities. But you can in terms of how communities are over-policed in different ways. So certain communities in Europe, and I'm thinking of Germany and the UK right now where I have the most experience, are policed in terms of transit points and where people are crossing borders or ostensibly going to cross borders. Over-policing in trains in Germany has led to lawsuits on grounds of discrimination, and has been justified in some way by the police saying, well, it's a public goods issue. We can't go after everyone. So we have to take a best guess. And based on our past practice, the best guess is people of color are going to be more likely to be undocumented. And that sort of rationale, I think, cuts through a lot of policing practice so that it doesn't have to use race explicitly, but it targets racialized communities for the very reason that they are visibly racialized communities. So that's just one example of how the law does not act as a really efficient backstop for this. And just how my work comes into this area as an academic, because I'm interested in these questions of belonging and of race in the European context, but also of social change. So I've just collaborated with a colleague to do a special issue on race, mental health, and state violence, where we look at how people who are dealing with mental health challenges and are racialized are acutely affected by these policing strategies to target certain communities. But also in my work as an activist and kind of a voluntary consultant for the Commission on the Death of Uri Jallo in Germany, it's been about seeing how families are leading the way. Bereaved family members of people who have died in custody are leading the way in claiming, this is what we want justice to look like, and these are the things that need to be discussed. And from a legal or social scientific perspective, my work is trying to bridge a gap in the language of policy and the language of campaigning for justice around these particular individuals who have died that's being pushed forward by family members.
Thank you, Eddie. You've given us a lot to think about. Terri?
Let me unmute myself, and apologies for my funky background here. It's kind of going in and out. But in any case, yes, I've been studying these topics since the 1990s. And so to kind of build on what Eddie was saying, for me, the awareness around policing issues came back in 1993 with the Stephen Lawrence murder. And the amazing thing is that inquiry and the prosecution and so on has been going on until the present day, pretty much. Even though there was a finding that structural discrimination was in place. And for those who don't know the story, I encourage you to look it up if you have an interest, because this was really a defining moment for this idea that structural racism was playing a role in policing in the UK. But then in 1995, the movie La Haine came out, and that happened to be the summer that I was doing my first round of research in France around issues of immigration. And the reason I approached the issue of the politics of immigration from the perspective I did is it was, I was coming at it from a US lens, obviously, but also a lot of academics and others were very critical of me coming at it from that, US lens. And I'm sure others I know others have experienced this as well. But the reality is what I was finding as I was, doing my work, I used immigration as a proxy for race. But the reality is that, there were different approaches to people from different immigration backgrounds. And so it was clear to me that race was playing a role because, of course, there's the visual aspect. The police see somebody who looks, North African or Black, and, they tend to police those people very differently. But, the movie La Haine really focused in on something that seems to be a recurring event in France is you have the police, somebody gets injured or killed by the police, there's the riots, and then there's, sort of inquiries, but really nothing happens. And that's part of the problem and it's this, you can see the same thing from the Stephen Lawrence situation is that, there's something happens, there's riots, there's inquiries, and then there's very little action taken, and they find, all kinds of reasons for why, this was not a racist event or whatever it may be. But, the fact that this is such a recurring event is important to understand in the broader context. And so in my most recent project, looking at the roots of racism, I talk about the fact that all of this goes back to the original history of interactions with Africa, starting in the 14 and 1500s, and how race was actually defined in Europe. And so I think what we forget is that the idea of racism, it didn't start in the US, it started in Europe. And those ideas have been perpetuated by academics. And so in any case, I have a whole book coming out on that topic. But I think it's important to understand the broader context and historical context that structural racism is something that is transatlantic. And that's why I really believe we need to have this transatlantic dialogue. And, I've been working on projects, my book on legislating equality, actually, Tamas was, and his organization was a very useful resource for that. But if you look at even the history of the development of anti-discrimination policy in Europe, it's really difficult, first of all, to get data, despite the fact that there are mandates for that now. And when I was doing my Roots of Racism book, to find data on policing is so difficult. So, we're doing this work. And for me, I'm not in academia anymore. I'm running a company called Brighter Higher Ed, but more broadly, these issues come back to how are we tackling racism? For me, it's from an activist as well as an academic perspective. And people like Rokhaya Diallo in France, and I mean, there's so many people working on these issues. So I really encourage people to take a look at what's going on and to understand why Black Lives Matter was so profoundly influential across Europe.
Thank you, Terri. Also a lot to grapple with. Tamas, your introductory statement, please.
Thank you very much, Akasami. Yeah, so I think that contrary to the impression one might have when reading bold statements, even from very high-ranking EU officials, saying that Europe is no doubt doing better on issues of race than the US, I think that policing and race and racial or ethnic profiling have been recognized more and more as an important issue and challenge by institutions in Europe for a long time. And I'm using race or ethnic origin and racial or ethnic profiling because legislation in Europe, for example, anti-discrimination legislation is using both of these terms, race or ethnic origin. So the Council of Europe, which covers the whole of geographical Europe, for example, issued a general policy recommendation in 2007 already on combating racism and racial discrimination in policing, which defines profiling with four main factors, which we can also see appearing in other documents from the international level, including the United Nations level. So there is even of course we can go back further in time to the Stephen Lawrence inquiry, as Terri mentioned, but at the European level I think there is more and more acknowledgement, and it has been Eddie alluded to that as well. I think there is an acceleration, and even before the George Floyd murder and the Black Lives Matter movement really hitting Europe this year, or well last year, I think we saw some strong statements from the Council of Europe Commissioner for Human Rights, from the Fundamental Rights Agency of the EU. Just last month, the Council of Europe's Parliamentary Assembly, bringing together members of parliament from all over Europe, they also issued a report on ethnic profiling in Europe, calling it a matter of great concern. And of course, we also have the EU, which traditionally has been rather slow in reacting to these issues. We have seen them coming up with an anti-racism action plan in September last year. As a result, I think very closely linked to the anti-racism protests. And we have a growing number of case law as well from the European Court of Human Rights, and also from national courts, ranging from issues uncovered in Russia and in Romania, linked to people of Caucasian origin or Roma persons, to Germany, where there have been issues with policing and profiling on the trains, and in the Netherlands or in France as well. So really there is, I think, a growing recognition. Now, how do equality bodies come into this picture? They are independent public authorities, similar to some extent to the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission in the US. And they have some relevant functions, such as legal powers. They can litigate or make decisions. They can do research. They can give advice to policymakers. They can promote good practices and do trainings, and they can communicate and raise awareness. EQUINET, as the network of European equality bodies, published a fact sheet and a compendium of good practices on ethnic profiling in spring 2019. And I can just list some of the challenges that we identified in that fact sheet. And of course, we can go further into them later on. We identified some institutional constraints when it comes to the lack of mandate, particularly the legal powers of equality bodies. And not only in one, but in two ways, because typically equality bodies, they do not have a mandate to deal with criminal matters. That's one. And then they also don't have a mandate to deal with discrimination in police actions, because the widely known race or racial equality directive does not cover state actions and police actions specifically. Then we also found a lack of data. We found massive evidentiary issues. It is very difficult to prove, of course, racial profiling and racism in police. There are some research problems. It is really difficult to research these issues. There are some issues about underreporting and outreach to the affected communities. And of course, it is very difficult to engage with law enforcement. And just 4 new issues or phases of ethnic profiling, which I wanted to also bring in to this introductory statement. One of them is artificial intelligence and predictive policing. I think that is a growing issue, and there is a recognition of the great risk that AI might carry in policing. Of course, COVID-19, I think besides George Floyd, COVID-19 was also maybe helped to awaken some of the policymakers to the massive issues when the confinement measures and the lockdown measures resulted in controls in a much higher proportion in communities which were mainly inhabited by Roma persons or Black or ethnic minority persons. And then counterterrorism measures. I think that's also really interesting how that is leading to some massive issues and massive discussions. We can see in France, for example, there are some massive, even just last Saturday, there were massive protests against the Global Security Bill, which would ban all malicious publication of photos of police officers in order to protect their security on and offline. Of course, one can imagine how that would hamper the efforts to document and prove police profiling and brutality. And the last one, which Eddie, I think, is much better placed to comment on, is intersectionality, of course. It is a massive issue. There are communities and subgroups within the communities which see and face even graver problems. Thank you.
Thank you all so much. So for my next question, and then after which we will turn to questions from the audience, please do put them in the chat, has to do with some of the issues you all brought up and mentioned. So there's this issue of data, underreporting, how difficult it is to have statistics on the extent of racial profiling and discriminatory action by the police against ethnic minorities and racialized groups. I'm wondering if each of you could say a bit about what some of the obstacles are to collecting this data on racism in policing, and especially given the context of this question of far-right infiltration of the police and state security forces. That's an issue we've seen in the media a little bit about in the case of Germany, in which there's the question of a few bad apples versus how extensive far-right infiltration may be within police and state security forces. So perhaps we'll go in the same order again. Eddie?
Sure, thanks. It's a good question. There are many approaches to that question, because I think the infiltration of the far right into policing institutions is not a new thing, but I think it speaks also to, having the discussion openly speaks to, I think, some advancement that's been won through, the pain and terror that some families have had to deal with. For example, in Germany with the National Socialist Underground cases, where, there were there's a far right group that was also being kind of surveilled by policing authorities that were surveilling this group even while they were killing mainly Turkish people. And then the police were investigating the Turkish families, suspecting them of having played a part through some illegal activity in the death of their family members. So that kind of brought the question to the fore of complicity or involvement of policing institutions with right-wing activity on one hand, and then the treatment of people of color and communities of color on the other hand, which is, of course, is not something new, and maybe that's an extreme example, but it is a concern. So the trust about the state having the data that we're talking about certainly is, there's a spectrum of having trust or having no trust. And the balance of the usefulness of collecting racial data is, of course, in the mix. So I've been at many meetings with NGOs where there have been a preponderance of people who are so distrustful that they don't want the data to be collected until communities can really craft a strategy about what the data would be, how it would look, for what purposes it would be used. Then I guess there are some legal issues, and I'm sure, you know, Terri and Tamas can speak more exactly to some of these legal issues, but there are constitutional orders that have put race in a very particular place in society. So we think of France as kind of the most extreme example in Europe, where there's a constitutional, almost a prohibition. It's not a complete prohibition, but it's the presumption of a prohibition of collecting racial statistics, which makes it difficult to track forms of structural racism. And that's partly the ideology of the French Republic. And it's not completely outside of the realm of European Union standards. I think it's stretching it to say that that's actually an effective way to deal with racism. I don't think it is. But there's not such a clear mandate from the European Union, for, as an example, on how to then collect data. So the action plan that Tamas mentioned is a really good step forward, and it actually mentions in it you should collect disaggregated data. Member states should collect disaggregated data. But because there's not direction on how that would work, especially in countries in France that actually reject it, and the majority of European Union countries reject it, and they default to a preponderance, to a presumption of not collecting it or having very strict remits for collecting it. It becomes it doesn't have a lot of traction. So we have to, I think critically about what kind of legal standards can be established in order to make data collection kind of a mandate. But it is balanced against how the communities can be involved with producing what that looks like. And I guess one last point, in the United Kingdom, which I think is on the other side of the spectrum from France, we have monitoring forms in employment context. Data is collected at the point of enrolling in schools. I mean, it's all optional, but many people fill this out because I think socially people understand that being counted and having some idea about the racial impacts on communities of services and funding and all of that make a difference. We collect lots of data, but then there are some issues with how the data is analyzed. For example, there's this category, Black and minority ethnic, which sometimes puts all the data for all people of color into one pot, and then it becomes difficult to see what the dynamics are within that. But it is on the other end of the spectrum, but then there's some of the racial disparate impact gets pushed into other areas. So we have data on how it's, how policing is over impacting people of color, but then sometimes there's not a solution, or sometimes the data is about a different type of data that keeps people in a certain position, being vague. But there was a policy called the hostile environment policy here in the UK, which was basically weaponizing deterrence. It was saying to people who would come to the UK as migrants or asylum seekers or refugees, we're going to make it difficult for you to come. I mean, it was called the hostile environment policy until they changed the language to the compliant environment policy. And it's about linking up all the social services. So all the funding services, medical services, housing, all had to report to the government. And because that's all linked up, you really can't live with any expectation of, treatment for basic services. You have to go underground and kind of live in the shadows. And that really does impact, people of color, people who aren't documented, and people who do have rights, but then don't know if they have rights, and then don't go to get their, medical needs met. So things like that really cross-cut, race, and Tamas mentioned intersectionality, race and how race interacts with immigration status, with gender, and with mental health. So I think even with collecting data, there's still a lot of analysis to do, but I think the problems maybe take on a different register and a different type of visibility when we do collect data. So I think data collection is really important in the rest of Europe.
Okay, thank you, Eddie. So talking a bit about, not just the specific issue of far-right infiltration, which maybe is more in the news most recently, but is an ongoing issue, but also the broader welfare state and the ways in which people can access social policy can also lead to a kind of over-policing. Terri.
Yes, excuse me, and Eddie's done a really good job of covering most of the issues here. The only thing I would add is that, there's, the historical basis. I always like to go back to the origins of many of these issues, which, in France, there's always been, the part of the problem is that France wants to act like they're colorblind, that there is no such thing as race. And so that's been really built into the norms around these issues, and yet the data is there, and we know, not that actually the data is not there because they refused to get it. And a lot of this has to do with just, what is, I think a lot of these countries grapple with what race is and how to define it and how to deal with groups who are disparately impacted by particular policies. And so there's been a lot of back and forth over the years about, being able to use survey. I mean, as a political scientist, we want to be able to use survey data and so on. And I've always struggled with trying to, in part, the reason we tend to focus on immigration and immigration status and other ways to get at race is because the data just aren't there. And people like Rahsaan Maxwell have been able to do some analysis based on race, and he has some interesting studies comparing the UK to France in areas of race. But in Germany, they even stopped doing a census for a long time because of the issues around, the going back to the Holocaust and the way that people were counted and defined and so on, and that the way that was utilized, to target people. And so there's this very real fear, both from immigrants and people of, different ethnic and racial backgrounds, that this data can be used, in negative ways, but it's so incredibly difficult to prove disparate impact. So, there have been things like, sending out resumes with different names on them or pictures or whatever it may be. So they've been able to show that there is disparate impact on particular groups or people who have ethnic sounding names. But it's been very, very difficult to, there isn't even, the concept of collective action on on discrimination. Here in the U.S., we have legal structures in place that allow people to create groups that can call for basically sue companies for discrimination, but we don't have. There isn't that same practice, legal practice in the and most. I don't think any European countries have that. But in any case, it's very difficult for groups to form in the first place because, for example, in France, it's only in the early 2000s that you started to see groups, developing around the Black identity, and you did have the BEURS, the Arab youth and so on, developing a group identity, but and then there's been more of a development of a Muslim political and group identity. But in many ways, the state has been pushing against the development of these group identities, which precludes both legal and political power to a certain extent. So the data issue is a big one, and there are issues on both sides of whether it should be collected and for what reasons. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Terri. I think you brought up a very interesting point about the lack of data and obstacles to mobilization for impacted groups. So that's very, very interesting. Tamas, your views.
Thank you, Akasami. Yeah, I think I was going to also refer to the Holocaust that Terri also mentioned. I think that, you know, understanding that from an American point of view is important. But I think there are limits to this referencing of the Holocaust when it comes to equality data collection. Rather, there should be limits to it. There aren't really limits in certain circles. And I think it should be completely acceptable to make that difference between accepting when it's racial or racialized communities and persons fearing how the data would be used. As Eddie mentioned, you know, you need guarantees, and it's completely understandable if people feel at unease or about their data being collected, their racial data being collected. But I find it extremely hypocritical when it's the authorities that are referring to the inability to collect data, even in the face of actually racial minorities and groups asking them to collect that data. So, and it's the same, a little bit, the story is the same with the EU and certain member states, because the member states are saying that, well, look, you know, under EU data protection rules, it's impossible for us to collect equality data. And then the EU goes like, no, it's fine. We are fine with that, guys. Just go and collect it. Just make it anonymized. Don't put the name, you know, don't make it easy to or possible to realize who you're talking about. We are fine with it. And then the member state goes like, yeah, but no, we still cannot do that. So, you know, it's the EU, the Holocaust, the feelings of racial minorities, everything is being used, even in the face of their wish to have data collected. And I think what makes it even more hypocritical is that when it comes to using the racial data to the detriment of the communities, then the authorities are quite fine with collecting, you know, in the shadow some data, like we saw, for example, in Sweden, where the police in the south of Sweden collected or had a register of people of Roma origin without having committed or being linked to any criminal activities. They had a register of Roma persons. Now that was of course found illegal. But when it comes to actually collecting equality data that would help us to uncover discrimination that's happening to these communities, then it certainly becomes and suddenly becomes impossible to collect such data. And I think I think that is a huge issue. And of course, as Terri said, in the absence of such data, what equality bodies, scholars, and lawyers, NGOs are trying to use are proxy indicators. So we have seen cases in Hungary, for example, where it was in the absence of ethnic data, it was impossible to prove ethnic profiling directly. So they had to use proxies such as the family name and the place of residence. Similarly, in other situations, the place of birth could also be used, or CCTV footage. But it is very difficult, and these are of course proxy indicators. And I think just one last thought is that it is especially important, or would be especially important, to have reliable ethnic data when it comes to police actions, exactly because profiling, for example, when it comes to racial profiling, you have to look at the collective practice. It's not enough to look at one case in isolation and one stop and search, for example. You have to look at how the authorities are conducting that. And when you see that, for example, according to a national survey in France, young men of Arab and African descent are 20 times more likely to be stopped and searched than any other male group. And in the UK, according to Home Office statistics, in England and Wales, Black people were 9.5 times more likely to be stopped as white people. Now that's unlikely, I think, to be just being unlucky or just a complete coincidence. So I think that the police actions are also typically the place where you need good ethnic data and racial data. Similarly to segregation, for example, in education, it's again not something that you can look at one individual case. You have to look at the whole picture and the collective. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tamas, and also bringing in important perspective on the situation in Hungary, Eastern Europe, important for our listeners. I'm now turning to questions from the audience, and perhaps one of you has something to share on this question, which is regarding to the issue of youth and incarceration. So what is the situation in Europe regarding youth? Is that something you've come across in which racialized youth are more likely to be incarcerated? I know there's some big differences in rates of incarceration between the US and Europe, but perhaps if you could say, one of you could say a bit about that issue of youth and incarceration in Europe, racialization.
I can just quickly say, just from the UK perspective, because looking at the intersection of race and youth across Europe, I haven't done that work. But in the UK, there are lots of studies about the relationship between, for instance, youth being excluded from schools and having the racial character of the exclusion, which is suspension or expulsion of young people from schools on one hand, and over policing on the other hand. And so there's, there are lots of studies about how this happens, and how there's, in London and other large cities in the UK, there's also the concept of kind of gang violence, and we can also see that in the United States. There's a long-standing over-policing of certain geographies in the UK that are predominantly, young Black people, and this is all kind of the, the social network of ideas about, from education to incarceration. And it's, I don't want to label it something like the school to prison pipeline, which is kind of the term for the concept in the United States. But it seems clear just from the reports that both the government and NGOs are doing that show how disproportionate it is that young communities of color are over-policed and over-incarcerated. A lot of those stops and searches are people who are on the younger side. So if anything, I think the intersection of youth and racialized communities tells a lot of the story of policing and criminal justice in the UK.
I would just add that it's very much a geographic and focus in terms of youth and the way that they're policed. So, for example, in France, the police will wait at certain subway stations because they lead to the suburbs where most of the youth, especially young people of color, live, and they are regularly asked for their papers and so on. So there's kind of an ongoing connection between the suburbs in around the large cities in France and the way that youth are policed, but that's also connected to things like unemployment. So there's so the geography is connected both to race and to employment levels, and that leads to criminality, but also kind of a criminalization that's of being unemployed. If you can, there's a really strong connection between those things. So geography and employment levels, things like that, play a major role in the way that youth are treated, both in the educational system, but also in terms of policing.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention also that there is clear data that shows that there are intersectionality issues here. So as it was pointed out by both Eddie and Terri, young people are much more likely to be stopped and searched, and young male especially, with some notable exceptions. I saw that according to the FRA, the Fundamental Rights Agency, which is an agency which collects data of the European Union, they found that, for example, among the Roma persons, both male and female, young and old, it doesn't really make a difference. Everyone is stopped and searched very heavily. So that's an interesting outlier, I would say. But in principle, young male are much more likely to be stopped and searched. And of course, what I referred to also, the segregation, which I very briefly mentioned when we talked about the data issue. If you don't give a chance for a usable and decent education to racial minorities, then of course that will also limit their chances for finding meaningful employment. And that whole thing is of course going to be connected with their chances in life.
Thank you. To move to another audience question, are there any specific countries within the EU that you know of that have made good progress establishing anti-racist laws and or promoting anti-racist culture?
Well, I can start on this one just for a change. So because of the European Union's Racial Equality Directive, since 2000, each and every European Union member state has to have legislation that prohibits racial discrimination. But the problem is that, as I mentioned, this directive doesn't cover police operations and state functions in general. So it's only in those countries that went beyond that and accepted that police functions and state functions should also be covered by anti-discrimination legislation that do so and that have legislation. It's not an EU obligation, not an EU level obligation. But again, I think that on the face of it, with legislation, in most cases, the problem is not really with the legislation, it's with the implementation of the legislation. That's of course is a massive generalization, but I see some nodding already. I think that there is of course always room for improvement, and I saw a question also relating to the UN third general recommendation, which just came out last month. There is always room to improve legislation, but I think that the main issue is not with legislation, but how it's implemented and how we cannot see it, how it's implemented because of the lack of data.
Yeah, I would just reiterate what Tamas said. I mean, I highly recommend my book, Legislating Equality, if you're interested in this topic, because it really, goes into detail in the lack of implementation of the RED. And so I think I guess I want to come back to the broader political perspective as a political scientist, but you have to keep in mind that all of this is very political, right? And so in the late 1990s or 1999, when you had the passage of the Racial Equality Directive, there were left politicians in place, and there was a much more momentum for fighting things like the far right Freedom Party in Austria and so on. And today, part of the reason we're seeing so much resistance to this is the rise of the far right, but not just the rise of the far right, but the movement of the far right discourses into the mainstream. And so mainstream conservative parties have all become, they're using the same rhetoric that the radical right was using back in the 1990s. And so that underlying political context is creating this pushback on doing anything about discrimination, race, policing, etc. And you can see this across Europe. And in the UK, for example, you've seen this persistent move towards more and more. I mean, what they're doing around making it difficult for refugees and immigrants to come and stay is very similar to what our previous administration was doing here. So that's why I always emphasize the transatlantic sharing on this. We did a conference on this a few years ago when I was still at UT Austin about kind of this transatlantic sharing around issues for, it's interesting that we aren't talking much about Islamophobia and these issues as much as we were back then. But anyway, my main point is that there is a broader political context that, it's not just that their policy isn't there, it's that there's active, engaged political processes and people that are pushing back against implementing and even addressing these issues.
I agree with what everyone has said, and there's just one kind of anecdote that I'll give, which is the UK a lot of times is seen within continental Europe as being a place where you can talk about these issues, where all of these remedies exist that don't exist in lots of continental Europe. And I brought all of that with me when I signed on to be on this commission for death in custody in Germany, where it was an uphill battle making the claim that this was potentially institutional discrimination. And because the UK had produced the Macpherson report that came out of the Stephen Lawrence tragedy, his killing in '93, and the Macpherson report came out in 2000. So we're already, at the time I went to Germany to take part in this commission, it was almost 10 years after the Macpherson report. So obviously, the language, it was about importing the language of this idea of institutional racism to make it do some sort of work in the German context. But of course, the political environment of having that be this new concept that institutions could unwittingly be racist was already a difficult proposition. But then on the other hand as well, in the UK, it's not that the Macpherson report revolutionized policing or was successful by the standards of the communities that are calling for justice. So yeah, now we know what institutional discrimination or institutional racism means, but it doesn't mean that there's an effective way to address it. Of course, in the UK, we have an inquest process, which is basically what the UK does in order to be in compliance with human rights law in Europe, investigates through a coroner's procedure the reason someone died in custody. And there you can ask all the questions you want, but then that doesn't mean there's going to be a successful prosecution of the police officer. We have an independent police complaints commission. Well, it's called something different now, but it basically is kind of a quasi-independent committee that investigates policing incidents. But people are dissatisfied with that because a lot of times it doesn't actually produce the type of in-depth investigation that's needed to uncover structural forms of racism. So we look great on paper, in other words, but that isn't enough. It really is about implementation and about bringing, these modes of analysis to bear on what's actually there in the legislation.
Well, we have time for just one last question, and I'm disappointed because I'm sure we could keep talking for at least another hour. This question is about hate crimes. So is the racialized violence that police commit against minorities, is that included in any national definitions of hate crimes or any EU-wide definitions of hate crimes? And related to that, what can be done at the EU level to combat racism and racially based violence that's rooted in institutions? So a final word on this topic from each of you. Maybe we'll start with Tamas.
Tough question. Well, hate crimes are not allowed in the EU. There is EU legislation. There is a framework decision in the EU, according to which each and every member state has to have legislation against hate crimes committed against, among others, racial and ethnic minorities. And data collection is really poor. It is really poor on what kind of hate crimes people report and what kind of hate crimes there are in the different countries, which is partly the fault of the legal systems. I think it's partly the fault of the police, because they don't necessarily have the right tools and also the right approach and the willingness to collect that data. Not the least also because we have leading case law. Like really, if you look up, for example, Nachova versus Bulgaria and many other cases also from Romania, the leading case law on hate crimes in front of the European Court of Human Rights is really about police committing hate crimes, especially against Roma people. That doesn't mean that that's the only hate crime that's happening in Europe, but that's really that's what spearheaded the campaign against hate crimes and prohibition of hate crimes in Europe. So it is a massive issue. It is often committed by the police, unfortunately, and the European Court of Human Rights took quite an activist role, I think, requiring the authorities not only to refrain from committing hate crimes, which is obvious, but also they condemned member states of the Council of Europe for not properly investigating the hate element in a crime. So, for example, when a crime was brought in front of them, and the investigation only focused on the murder, for example, in the most extreme cases, but it did not look into what kind of role the racial origin of the person, the victim, played in the crime. And the European Court of Human Rights said that this procedural problem is enough to condemn the country for not having properly investigated the crime. So these are just some random thoughts and observations, and I'll leave Terri and Eddie comment further.
Oh, Terri?
Having trouble unmuting myself there. Yeah, I mean, I don't have a whole lot to add. I think the problem is that there hasn't been a clear definition of hate crimes. You know, there's clearly, and I mean, you know, kind of for the police to take action. And so I think there's a lot of focus on, you know, anti-Semitism, for certainly, but not, it's very difficult because we don't define who is a target of a hate crime. It's very difficult for police to take action. And so I think this is a big problem more generally. And again, you know, there's a lot of legislation and policy out there that actually also just isn't implemented. So even if there are definitions and so on, it's very, very rare to see, you know, these things actually being implemented in a way that, you know, can actually have some impact. But I'll leave that as my last word. I'll let Eddie take the last shot.
Thank you. I think, yeah, this is also an area where I think I have so many different thoughts about hate crimes, because I also am involved with communities of scholars and activists who think that hate crimes legislation, if it's going to increase sentencing, expands the criminal justice network, and there are critiques of hate crimes that I think are really useful. Well, I guess not on the other hand, there's also the phenomenon in the UK over the last few years, in the wake of Brexit and the decision to kind of turn inward in a certain way in the United Kingdom. Hate crimes based on race and ethnicity have been on the rise. So, you know, Brexit was about closing off to Europe in one way, but it was really also about, you know, I got a campaigning notice through my door during the Brexit, you know, the run up to the Brexit decision. And it was all about preventing people from coming across the EU from Iran, from Iraq, from Syria. And so it was framed also as a racialized, you know, as against people racialized as non-white. And then you see the hate crimes statistics in the years after Brexit show an increase of, I think it was the last few years, of 11% of increase in racially motivated hate crimes. So I mean, I think it's a useful tool to think about. In the UK, a lot of the hate crime statistics are from police, ones that are reported to police. So there's also the question of underreporting and whether the statistics actually tell an accurate story. And I guess I'll end with Tamas's comment about the biggest cases at the court in Strasbourg, Court of Justice, the European Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg, being about hate crimes. I'd never thought of it that way, actually. I'd always thought of, because I'm tunnel visioned on thinking about the intersection of human rights law and equality provision in Article 14, I never really thought of the idea of the withdrawal of a human right as kind of the criminal element of the hate crimes, so making conceptually like a hate crime. I hadn't thought of that, but of course, conceptually that does work. It's just a really interesting way of thinking about what's at stake for people who are bringing human rights claims, that it's akin to a crime to withhold a human right and to do it for the reasons of a ground that's supposed to be protected. So a category that's supposed to be protected is quite telling. So I think that's an indictment, I think, of where we are in Europe with policing and race, really.
Well, on that note, I would like to thank our distinguished panel, Eddie, Terri, Tamas. Thank you so much for participating and sharing your expertise. And my thanks also to the audience for your insightful questions and for your engagement. I hope we can all come together again to continue this important and fascinating discussion. Be well and stay safe, and please do join our mailing list at the Institute of European Studies, as the issues of race in Europe are not new topics for us, and we encourage you to peruse more of our offerings on these and other issues. Thank you so much.